Good evening. It's great to have this wonderful, wonderful audience here tonight. I know many of you were very close to Professor Eduard Sekler, and it's really, I'm so grateful that you've decided to join us. Before I start, I just received a little notebook from Pat Sekler, Edward's wife and wonderful collaborator for many years. And it would be great. There's so many friends. I'm just going to pass it here. And Pat wants all of us to write our names in this book and then make sure that I get it back. Or Pat gets it or something like that. So we really have a treat for you. So just a few words from me. Obviously, it's clear that this event is in honor of Professor Eduard Sekler. And many of you know that Professor Eduard Sekler was here at the GSD, involved with Harvard for over 50 years, coming originally from Vienna, having studied in Europe, in Austria, then in London at the Warburg Institute, eventually arriving here in the 1950s and remaining here and often between Cambridge and Vienna every year until he sadly passed away on May 1st of this 2017. Edward and Pat actually until very, very recently have been very much part of this building. And in the building where even after retirement, Edward continued to be engaged with his research. And apart from his own scholarship, I think he was, of course, very much connected with issues of conservation towards the actually for a long time, but especially towards the latter part of his life. And there are a number of individuals here who have collaborated with him and have continued some of the collaborations that they started together, especially the Kathmandu Valley Preservation Trust that was started in, I believe, in 1990. From the beginning, Professor Sekler's scholarship was incredibly diverse, writing about a whole range of topics, very significant publications on the work of Wren, on Joseph Hoffman, on Le Corbusier, a publication that he collaborated together with William Curtis, many, many other works and writings. Pat reminded me actually earlier that one of the many essays and articles is a piece that's not very long, but it's been very influential here at the GSD. It's a text that's on structure, construction, and tectonics. And it's a wonderful piece. And in some ways, that piece also has certain parallels with, I think, with what we are going to also hear from Professor Silvetti tonight, and I think that that's also a very, very important issue to mention, that just simply in terms of the kind of diversity of the range of scholarship of Professor Eduard Sekler. When Edward came to Harvard, I think it was also a transition point because Edward had been very much involved with Siam, had visited many of the places, going to Dubrovnik and many other places as part of Siam. And Siam itself was actually changing, so he was obviously connected both with people like Gropius and Gideon, but I think he also saw that the transition from the world of Siam and Corp to the latter part with the arrival of José Luis Sert and the shifts of the school, finally coming to the GSD, but even in some sense more critically for Edward, the involvement with the Carpenter Center and being the first director of the Carpenter sector, and having an appointment both within the context of the Carpenter Center, that is FAS and the GSD, something that's really quite rare today. And being the first director, and we're lucky to have the current director of the Carpenter Center here with us, meant that this was also a very important moment in terms of the connections between the university, undergraduate education, and the GSD, something that is very hard for us to envisage, that level of closeness and sort of proximity. And I think he, as the person who was involved with the history and theory courses, I think saw this shift also from, in a sense, modernism to the focus towards urbanization and urbanism as key things. And it's probably hard for us to envisage how critical this connection with Europe was between the GSD and Europe at that time. In fact, earlier today we had a conversation with Martha Tedeschi, who's the director of the Harvard Art Museum and is with us, about the Bauhaus exhibition that is happening. And in a way, you need those kinds of discussions to realize about the importance, in some ways, of this conversation between Harvard, between the GSD and the Bauhaus, and how this issue of the connection with Europe was so important. And now the school is really much more international in some ways than the connections with Europe are probably there very much, but they're not as focused and as singular as they were during this period that Edward was so involved with the school. So in some sense, we have someone who's really contributed enormously to the life of the school, and we're really delighted that you're here and we can celebrate the contributions of Professor Eduard Sekler. We're going to have a wonderful lecture by Professor Jorge Silvetti, and then after that we'll have some comments and reflections more specifically about Professor Sekler from Professor Toshiko Mori. And then there will be a conversation, and then we will have a chance also to engage both of them in conversation. You all know that Professor Toshiko Mori is a former chair of the department, an architect who has also been very much involved with a number of significant buildings and projects, as well as really dealing with modernist buildings and the issue of conservation, which I think is also very dear to her heart, and shared that very much with Professor Sekler. I think in addition to those projects, of course, Toshiko has had a very strong social agenda, being involved with the whole, the Davos global agenda that is focusing on design and linking many of her research and projects also to initiatives involving projects in Africa and so on. So I think she is very well suited to discuss these broader issues. Professor Jorge Silvetti has been teaching here at the GSD for a long time, and it's fantastic that he is. We are really, 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 really honored and I think privileged to have him be part of the faculty. Together with his partner, Rodolfo Machado, they run really in many ways, the practice in Boston that has not only delivered so many important buildings, but a practice that also has had at its core a very strong intellectual project in many ways. I was just talking to Jorge about some of the buildings, and recently I've had the chance to see, for example, one of his buildings, the art museum at Bodin, in detail, as well as many other buildings. And I can't tell you how remarkable it is to sort of look at buildings like that appear to be very simple, but require incredible amount of craft and precision for their simplicity to be realized. For those of you who know, this is a building where on the street all you see is basically a glass pavilion, but actually the relationship between the new building and the existing building on the campus, and how the modern and the classical components of this project come together. I think it's really beautifully handled. There are many, many other projects to mention, but I think all of these projects also tie into Jorge's deep commitment to architecture as an intellectual project as well. And there's a very long kind of history of that. One of his favorite words is realism, and he's written a lot about questions involving realism and the concept of verisimilitude. And these are topics that I think we need to discuss more and more, and I hope that we're going to hear more from Professor Silvetti tonight, discussing the issue of typology. And so without any further delay on my part, please welcome Professor Jorge Silvetti.
Thank you, Mohsen, and thank you all for being here tonight to honor the memory and the legacy of Eduard Sekler, who for more than 50 years, as the Dean said, promoted tenaciously the virtues of a continuous interaction between the teaching and research of the history of architecture and the learning and practicing of the métier of the architect. Oh, here it is. He was a dear friend, and this is a picture that Pat sent me only a few weeks ago that she found, and I thank her so much for this. He was a dear friend, a colleague, a mentor, and an extraordinary neighbor. For decades, he was 2 doors away from my office in this building, and our frequent casual encounters in the corridor or the mail room would invariably end up in memorable conversations about architecture and life, some of them among the most precious moments I would retain of my collegial life at this institution. It is precisely because of Eduard's unique profile as both a trained architect and an architectural historian that when confronted with the honor I received to represent the school in this event, together with the responsibility of honoring someone of his stature, I decided that the best and honest way to go about it was to attempt to transmit through a series of thoughts, illustrations, and hypotheses how architectural history actively and creatively works in the mind of a designer. I hope that I can rise to the occasion, one that is full of emotions and anticipations for me, as I felt all along in preparing it, and that I was and I am truly presenting this to Eduard for his consideration, critique, and advice, as I did many times with my work and my ideas. In that sense, this is also my very personal tribute to him. It is interesting, a good moment to bring the discussion of the dynamics of architectural history and architectural practice into the school, as we are in the midst of the unfolding of the second Chicago Architecture Biennial, which is entitled Make New History, and which defines as its objectives, I quote, to understand the channel through which history moves and is shaped in architecture today, unquote. One of the main impetus inspiring its curators, Sharon, Johnston, and Mark Lee, to repropose the discussion of the connection between history and practice quickly unfolds in the exhibits into a series of issues, questions, and problems that sharply help make us think again and anew about this interaction. It is not surprising that a call to reconsider the relationships between the practice of design, which from now on I will call the project, and the history of architecture, would put back in the table almost immediately the concept of type and typology. And it is not surprising either that in reproposing this topic, it resorts to both the seemingly inevitable analogy with language and to the reminder that typology works across historical periods, styles, and geographies. I would like to focus on this reappearance, but with the reminder that history does not repeat itself, and that if we hear words and thoughts that resonate with the not-so-distant past, it is an intellectual obligation to understand and flesh out as quickly as possible what is different, new, and unique that distinguishes Israeli usage and meaning at this moment. I would like only to sketch out this fresh situation as I see it, and to stake out the intellectual territory that it occupies and in which it acts, so that we could explore this relationship of history and the project today without falling into false continuities. It helps me to start by recalling a very important moment when similarly the world of architecture was reminded of the relevance of the concept of type in a famous article by Giulio Carlo Argan on the early 60s. Important for many reasons, for what it says and what it doesn't, and for its appearance in the field of architectural practice, for which it was not originally intended, in a reprint by the now legendary architectural design magazine, the Architectural Design Magazine of Monica Pigeon, at a time that for many it was feeling as the twilight date of a languishing modernism. From this, architecture needed only a decade and a half to see a subsequent flurry of active architectural minds working around it, both in terms of the project and of theory. An Anglo-Saxon view and a continental view all reflected a renewed interest in the foundational role of architectural history in the project, the use of precedent and type, an indisputable protagonistic role of the city in the speculation and theorization about urbanism, architecture, and their relationships to culture. But they did not share their same understanding of the nature of type, and certainly a different view of what city they were referring to. At the height of this intense period of theoretical and design production in 1978, a landmark contribution and pivotal point to this profound debate was that of Rafael Moneo's article in Opposition 13 that clarified not only our understanding of typology's roles in the project, but as importantly, with lucidity and succinctness, it historicizes the diverse incarnations of the concept of type and typology in the history of architectural thinking. Let me recall its memorable opening statement. To raise the question of typology in architecture is to raise the question of the nature of architecture itself. Immediately followed by yet another, in which he relativizes the very unity of the concept of type and typology by establishing the dialectics at play. To answer it means for each generation a redefinition of the essence of architecture and an explanation of all its attendant problems. This in turn requires the establishment of a theory whose first question must be, what kind of object is a work of architecture? This question ultimately has to return to the concept of type. This is a powerful conceptual capsule, which he then proceeds to develop systematically in its historical, theoretical, and operative dimensions. I take now from Moneo's argument the complex dialectics of the nature of typology. On the one hand, the implicit unifying idea that typology and type are constitutive parts of what architecture is, but also, and on the other hand, that as such they are not immutable, but rather they are variables that in the process of design occupy different positions and partake on different roles depending on the historical circumstances and opportunities, and perhaps, yes, even on the spirits of the times. At this point, I need to state perhaps the obvious, but sometimes forgotten condition of existence of this concept, that for all the temptations to analogize it to the natural science, from where it borrows its vocabulary, architectural typology is not a scientific category, but an ideological construct, one that exists in culture like any narrative literary structure that organizes, explains, and enacts its cultural practices. As such, its theoretical outlook and position is variable. It is the accumulation of these different positionings that I want to review first tonight, starting with the semi-conscious awareness that maybe there are buildings that share formal properties, something that was certainly evident to an observer at the time of Vitruvius and became clearer later with the tangible reality of the cities of the Renaissance, when buildings could be perceived and understood as belonging to classes of buildings. To this, Serlio stepped up with the first proto-classification that created a framework around which a discourse about the still unnamed concept of type could evolve and emerge. Such conceptual breakthrough needed to wait for the fertile 17th and 18th century, particularly in France with Perrault, Laugier, Quatremer de Cancy, who saw type as a vehicle for ideation, up to the end of the 18th, to Boulez and Ledoux's work in the late century, who proposed a substantial, serious theoretical content to those observable classes of buildings by coining the term that defines a new concept, character, which for them is that which makes buildings communicate what they are for and thus elevates type from its mere relationship to building to the category of architecture and begins to insinuate the concept as an operational one and not just as a historical category of analysis. It is soon after when their student Jean-Nicolas Durand truly swerves the course of this conceptual evolution, transforming character into genre and moving from discourse to methodology. In this vision, the grid, the axis, and the operation of composition of elements based on a limited repertoire of forms are the interactive elements of a method that could produce any building. They are also the emblems of the typological birthmark, no more nor less, of formal architectural education, of which we are all inheritors. We have then discourse and method after installed in our consciousness as significant moments for our analysis. Here, a word perhaps is needed to register the ambiguous relationship of modernism towards type and typology. Within the diversity of incarnations of modernism, it is possible to find a consistent and recurrent idea of type directly tied to the Beaux-Arts tradition and methodologies of composition, as many historians and theorists, Rainer Banham notably, have pointed out, but noticing that while they all remain ambivalent, if not antagonistic, to the role that historical precedent might play in the process of design, they do so while displaying all along a constant adherence to the rationale that it was indeed very modern to classify certain formal classes of buildings and even offer them in the format of catalog as long as they were types of modern invention, such as one of its most defining topics, function, and of which housing typologies is a paradigm. It is this oscillating path of changing positions that makes us, or at least myself, ask on the occasion of this call to restart the discourse of typology, where are we today in our theoretical and operational relationships to them? And I'm going to have some water now. I don't think I can get those answers tonight, but I can sense that we can describe the field, stake out the conceptual territory, and take a calculated position so as to then begin the task. And for that, I propose an exercise of analysis that I found revelatory. Let's say, for a lack of a better word, that we are going to psychoanalyze the typological mind by going to its unconscious origins, observing the material and factual basis on which it is founded and how it acts, that is, on the prediscursive moment, when typology did not exist as a consciousness, a method, or a conceptual apparatus, when we only had the facts of buildings. This is important because if acting as historians do, and for good reasons, we rely on historical evidence based on written material and discourse, then the Renaissance is our only possible starting point for understanding typology. What I'm proposing, in short, is to complete the scope of our understanding by attempting to describe the full arch of typology's presence as it accompanies architecture from its very beginnings in the act of making at the times when, while architecture is indisputable present in the life of men, the intellectual awareness of any typological structure, theorization, or further methodological proposition was not. We will then, perhaps, get a glimpse of the infancy of the typological mind at its moments of innocence. In short, let's try a sort of anthropology of the concept of typology. After that, we can complete such charge by considering the question as to where we are today. For tonight, and as a first step, let's just move only a little further back in time from the Renaissance and place ourselves in the High Middle Ages and at a remarkable place, Sicily. Why that? To make a very long story short, it's sufficient to say Sicily is a very important and formative part of my life as an architect. One that provides me with rich resources to get to what I want to explore tonight, and one in which Dean Gerald McHugh, who is here tonight, had a direct and decisive involvement in the role that GSD played on it. I think I'm in the wrong slide, but anyway. Juan, am I? First, an event in that was the one I should have had all along. So I'll give you a few minutes to connect to what I said. I'm one behind. First, an event in 1988. I was invited to participate in an international symposium in Palermo to celebrate the 800th anniversary of the consecration of the cathedral. It was organized as a gathering of scholars and practitioners with the aim to obtain informed and consensual strategies about how to approach the restoration and conservation of this unique and complex monument. The cathedral today shows in its architectural magnificence the record and wealth of the different civilizing moments of its history, with major modifying interventions during the Renaissance, Baroque, and Neoclassical periods, as well as displaying the visible vestiges of all its earlier Norman foundational stages in the 12th century. To my surprise, over 3 days of deliberation by scholars in the fields of history, history of art, history of architecture, archaeology, paleography, and architectural conservation yielded no insights or serious advice to help the imminent decisions to proceed with conservation and restoration measures in the monument. What it did produce, though, was a partisan war between factions defending a certain historical or stylistic period and promoting selective erasures of some in favor of others, and all of this in the name of authenticity. I surprised myself with my response on a forum where I had arrived humbly as an outsider, hoping to learn from learned colleagues about respect and care for the monument. I discarded my prepared speech in favor of an improvised ardent rejoinder based on the very important aesthetic as well as intellectual experience I've had with this building that I saw as part of a larger, extensive experience of the unique architecture of this island. At that time, after 8 years of work and having traveled constantly from one end to the other, the confines of Sicily, I had always delighted at one particular felicitous historical coincidence in the region of Palermo. In parallel to its cathedral, there are 2 other ones that were erected concurrently in the last decades in the 12th century, all promoted by the same patron, the Norman king, and driven by an equal goal, to become the mother cathedral of the recently established Norman Kingdom of Sicily. Needless to say, in the context of our conversation, the 3 shared identical architectural typological origins. Starting with the earliest Cefalù, glorious place, and following by Monreale almost concurrently with the Cathedral of Palermo, these 3 competing magnificent monumental works provide a perfect laboratory for a comparative exploration of how a preconscious typological mind would imagine and create a building, deal with programmatic requirements, specific sites, social, political, material conditions, and over time evolve along their own individual trajectories to produce highly singular, different buildings. Let me cut through details and summarize this rich history by saying that what prompted my reaction at the symposium was my awareness of those startling differences among them, singularities that these rebuildings present precisely as the tangible historical and artistic lesson that they propose, one next to each other and capable of being experienced in a single-day journey. And that's the map of their proximity, about the multiple possibilities that an identical initial defining formal starting point offered for their diverging itineraries, which make each one of them become a unique and extraordinary piece of architecture. Cefalù is where we can test and experience the original idea almost intact and the pains of its typological struggles. Monreale, and we'll talk more a little bit later, where we assist to an unmatched spatial mutation that alters the building experience as it becomes a literal canvas for the propagation of the faith in their unfolding over the interior walls of an iconographic program that leaves no square inch uncovered. Palermo instead registers the animated, intense, and at times violent architectural history of this particular society, its ideology, its politics, its struggles over 7 centuries. That's for me at the symposium to favor one period over another as authentic was denying Palermo precisely its authenticity of having been protagonist of a very different history than their 2 other nearby siblings. Here we see the original descriptions, graphic descriptions of the 3 and their respective dates of consecration. These look, typologically speaking, pretty much of the same at first, but on closer look, they begin to show some dissimilarities that are significant for this discussion. Cefalù, the one chronologically more distant from the other 2, reflects clearly a divergent format of what would become normative after that, and what is known as Sicilian Norman architecture. The marked difference in the plan, the addition of an extra component in the sanctuary in the following 2 cathedrals, is supported by the political mutation of Sicily in that period, the functional ritualistic requirements in the late 12th century to accommodate in the cathedral both the thrones and the burial sites of the king's family and those of the archbishops require more space than what Cefalù could provide. Hence, the doubling up of what appears to be the crossing excuse me. I think we're there, yeah. The doubling up of what appears to be the crossing, or in the liturgical language, the additions of the unusual antititulus to the titulus, whose absence in Cefalù eliminated it immediately as a contender. It just came too early. Such an expansion is easy to understand for functional reasons, but it is also already a red flag. What are these titulus and antititulus? We need just a parenthesis for a bit of straight history here. The adventurous Normans conquered Sicily in 1060, after a sweeping spread through the confines of the continent with final stops in 2 of their major islands. But while upon their arrival in Britain, they found and conquered a marginal Anglo-Saxon European Christian domain, in Sicily itself, the central point in the Mediterranean, they confronted a centuries-old complex and well-organized society that was shaped by the accumulated sediments of the cultures that had inhabited this island at the crossroads of the Mediterranean. Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, and Arabs, this is on the year 1000, before they arrived. Indeed, when the Normans arrived, what they found and conquered was a society where the prevalent political, social, cultural makeup was that of a fresh, cultivated, and inspiring Islamic society that had spread from the Middle East to Spain through northern Africa. To make things more complex, this well-organized and evolved society ruled by the Fatimid dynasty was a politically and administratively tolerant society. that allowed Christianity to exist and even flourish. But, and this is important, it was not the Christianity that the Normans brought in, that is, the Roman Latin Christian, but the Oriental, Greco-Byzantine rule, and this displacement presented for the conquering Normans a double adversary to be dominated both politically and ideologically, as the Eastern Christian Church was already a rebel to the Roman papacy and on the initial days of their definitive schism of 1054. This cultural and ideological panorama as a context, together with what will be a continuous, clear political strategy of the Normans to be flexible and accommodating to circumstance and locality, begin to give us an important clue to understand these and other transformative cycles of established architectural precedents. We now look really close to these plans and begin to notice very strange things. It was not, as we thought first, a basilical Latin plan after all, although it did want to be one. What we have here is an unprecedented, in fact, unimaginable conflation of plans of both rival rights. Excuse me, I just look, yeah. Half a Latin basilica and half a Byzantine centralized cross plan. A recognition that, while coming with the blessing of the Roman Pope, the reality in the field obliged the Normans to address and include the Byzantine rights of the local Christian flock. The consequences are enormous, and there are new and for a while uncertain and unresolved relationships between nave and sanctuary, just to notice the most evident and never resolved, the contradiction between the desired Latin transept, and this is Cefalù, and the centralized crossing. And only later they are smoothed out but never resolved in other Norman buildings like this, in which it appears now as a unity, but still they don't know what to do with the transept or the centralized plan. Moreover, now imagine, I know you all have images of that, the campanile, which was a somewhat free-flowing element in Western Europe, sometimes extant, sometimes on one side, others at the center or in the back, but a prevalent feature of the Romanesque churches, here is perfunctorily located in Cefalù and Monreale as a robust, disproportionately broad flanking pair in the facade. Excuse me. This, in the facade. I'm going to go back to this. Disguising what in reality they were, military defensive structures. A defensive motivation that becomes very explicit in the most striking move of the later one, the Cathedral of Palermo, when the defensive tower emerges as a distinctive compositional element on its own right and without precedent in the whole history of church building. It is a massive single tower located precisely on axis with the nave of the church in front of the facade, with which it shares its width, thus from a military standpoint amplifying the visual reach of the and defensive efficiency of the cathedral that doubles up now as a fortress with an unusual and very efficient continuous circulation loop. Excuse me, this is not moving. I should have all these slides. It's not moving forward. Oh, okay, that's it. So that's what I was trying to show you. That tower in front, and then the continuous circulation loop that requires the construction of two supportive arches in the main facade. And there you have the passages, the inside section in the middle, the red dots are those passages, in the main facade to bridge the street and complete the circuit. Now, staying on focusing on these towers as purely formal elements help us change yet again our direction of inquiry to reveal another dimension of this story of intense formal cross-fertilization and transformations. These massive prismatic volumes of those towers, are part of a material, technological, as well as formal vocabulary that populated the island by the 12th century, Arab defensive square point towers, all over the island. Indeed, the Norman dynasty of the Hautevilles did not come to Sicily carrying in their Vikings via Normandy luggage a complete kit of architectural, artistic, technical, and ideological ready-mades. They brought memories of buildings, of experiences, and practical knowledge that they were forced to adapt, complement, or change under local conditions. And the local conditions were those of a well-organized and advanced society with its own architecture and engineering and skilled labor, well above the practical knowledge that these Nordic adventurers could deploy. And there was a local Arab aesthetic so peculiarly consistent and widespread throughout Sicily during their almost 4 centuries of Arab dominance, a type of masonry construction and precision labor that produced this massive, prismatic, and crisp chiseled, detailed, and carved-in architecture with filigreed geometric decorations and elaborate structural motifs that continue to appear long after the Normans are settled and in control, particularly when we move from religious architecture into noble domestic architecture, where freedom from traditions, rituals, and symbols are more possible. It seems unbelievable that these images you are seeing are the palaces of Norman kings and nobles, only a few generations separated from their origins in northwest France and earlier roots in Scandinavia. Finally, a decisive touch we find in the interiors of this so-called Norman Arab architecture. And those interiors are neither. Another yet different artistic practice rooted in another cultural and technological source. And this is the Cathedral of Montreal, that finally gives this architecture its complex identity. Unsurpassed mosaics of Byzantine pedigree, attesting yet to another prior civilization that just remained after their political demise in the hands and eyes of their building trades. We are at the point we can take some stock out of all of this. What we see in this intense and short-lived episode is only 4 generations, 150 years, no more, episode of architectural experimentation, is the productive dynamics of an unchecked typological force in action, without labeled earlier a preconscious moment when typology is just an operative force fed by the accumulated experience of a culture and propelled by the particular demands of place and time that need to be articulated into forms, all without the pause and consideration required by theory and conceptual frameworks. I would like to characterize this preconscious moment as defined or inhabited by techne. It is remarkable to see the ease with which opposite ideas and symbols and the force of functions, ideology, politics, technology, and craftsmanship harmonize and express, in each case, a strong sense of determination to move ahead and to create, yes, new architecture. Because what is ultimately even more impressive is the resulting feast of creativity, inventiveness, and formal as well as ideological freedom. All this has on the occasions when it needs to work out problems. How the confrontation of rival, adversary, contradictory, or presumably irreconcilable and antithetical ideas and elements mix, blend, copulate, as it were, and create the new, the ineffable, the pleasurable. It confirms the loose connection that formal play has with typological rigor, but at the same time, its dependence on the permanence of some formal cues and relationships that assure intelligibility, continuity, communication. Just a sample of some of the contemporary buildings to these cathedrals that appear around Palermo. And I'm going to let the images somehow speak for themselves. This is San Giovanni degli Eremiti in Palermo, all contemporary of the cathedrals. This is La Magione on the other type of more austere and geometrical aesthetics. And this is now the jewel for me of the crown, San Cataldo, a tiny, almost toy-like church of carved stone. I want to take note without further elaboration and for everyone to think and ponder that typology, in whatever degree of consciousness it acts in the minds and hands of the designers, certainly demonstrate in these architectural examples the power it possesses and the central role it assumes in the articulation of the complex variables and issues related to the expression of cultural identity and to the integration of cultural diversity at both levels of the production of architecture. On the one hand, at the conception of new works, and on the other, at the formulations of a strategy for the conservation of old ones. Themes that I need not to stress much to this audience are pressing and inescapable today in the practice of architecture, a practice of cultural significance per excellence. And that will be a topic that I would very much like to elaborate further, but in the future. Furthermore, the parallelism of these similar yet different architectural occurrences call into question, inevitably, conventional definitions of authenticity. But there is one more very important attribute of type in the way we have come to understand these relations to visuality and the imagination that I would like to extract from these examples. If we look again at the Cathedral of Palermo now in reverse historical sequence, understanding that what we are seeing today is the result of a series of continuous changes, not only in ornamentation and decor, but also on the overall spatial configuration and image of the building, starting with the radical expert transformation in the hands of the Florentine neoclassical architect Ferdinando Fuga at the end of the 18th century, which finally managed to transform the still odd Norman Arab Byzantine hybrid into a veritable Roman Catholic church, Latin cross basilican artifact with its dome and its unifying interior organization. Not a change easy to swallow for us today, regardless of its intrinsic and screenful This is a reconstruction from an original painting on a middle time. We are going to see three, and I have to thank Juan Sala for being the artist that have done these recreations on the original, who has helped me actually work with all the images in this presentation, and without his help, I would not be really get anything as clearly my message through. This is the original painting, which is Palermo in 1781, before Fuga put his hands on it, but which really reflects the 16th century transformations, and nothing much will happen that. But this is the original Cathedral of Palermo, the one we've been talking, that I was explaining before. And this is responding to all the evidence in the building itself, in the documents, and of course in the original construction and structure. What is stunning is that the ease with which the image of the building disassociates itself from the typology that is corresponding immutable plan type produced. And it underlines the non-necessity of a strict or even logical, let alone necessary relationship between an abstract or generic notion of type and that of its image. And it was on this, let's call it, mutual indifference between type and image that much of the initial energy of postmodernism rested on and played with. I focus on that because while today this may seem obvious, it was not the most prevalent notion both in the history and the practice of architecture of how type operated until that moment in the late 20th century. And that brings our discussion somewhat abruptly to the other end of the chronological arch and to our days. We can take a deep breath and now look at the two exemplar protagonists of that moment of awareness, Robert Venturi and Aldo Rossi. These, for me, are their portraits, who relied on the possibility and need to disconnect and abstract generic forms from a concrete image for the exploration and their concerns in the project, although in opposite ways. In Venturi's case, the complex relationship between typology, history, and image was inherent in the way he understood and conceived architecture. He sought solid sustenance in the history of Western art and architecture as source of precedent and knowledge. But having detected early on the possibility of separation of image from type, interestingly enough, in complexity and contradiction, using the example of a Norman Arab Palermo's mosaics as applied to the building as a continuous, malleable surface, he offers not just an explanation of how an image works in this architecture, at least in the American urban landscape, but also proposes a methodology of work that would permit and give validity to the image's free play and in his project. What is the decorated shed, a concept worked together with Dennis Scott Brown, but a powerful demonstration of that principle and which they followed religiously all their work. Rossi, on the other end of the spectrum, struggled with a counterforce. While declaring early on that type is indifferent to function, he is silent about such possibility between type and image. For his purpose, he needs a stable image. He's on a deep search for an ultimate and inexpugnable principle that would anchor the elusive type into the larger and more solid matrix of the city. And in proving his thesis, he succumbs inexorably to image, as architecture always does when it wants to persuade, but it is not yet present in the world. It needs a drawing, a model, or a miniature that could synthesize and convey the principle. Indeed, Rossi, in his attempt to represent and condense the abstract, complex, and expansive conceptual model that puts in motion the dynamics of the trio, architectural typology, urban morphology, and collective memory, demands the impossible, to find a synthetic visual illustration that could embody such complexity. And that image, which needs to be expressed in a drawing, cannot be specific but abstract, which is, of course, an impossibility. But even if the task is impossible, it is complicated by his own reductive and personal views as to what are the constitutive elements of his complex vision. His own words on these beautiful paragraphs full of images are nevertheless the equivalent of the closing of the door to the possibilities of typology in action. Peter Ausen's caustic but incisive characterization of Rossi's buildings as representations of his drawings put the finger in the wound, showing the potential of Rossi's extraordinary propositions being capable of causing their own undoing and demise. In fact, there is something purely circumstantial about the way in which the tremendous impact of Rossi's ideas led to their instantaneous mass consumption as a result of a dissemination that was effected mostly by means of the powerful images of his drawings. A process my generation witnessed with awe that was fast and widespread and which reduced all the richness of his thinking to the power of a few condensed images, which in turn ended by being synthesized in a single one, The Lonely Cabin. For all its profound intellectual intensity, Ross's typology enshrined in mesmerized drawings and less convincing buildings, with all their simplicity, impacting communicability, and resonating reference to primeval elementary architectures, the primitive hut of all became reduced in its dissemination to the innocent cabin, and as such, to a universal icon. Both the reductionist precipice opened by Ross's type and the open-ended ability of Venturi type to play free with images, both undertakings intellectually profound and visually provocative, undermine their very efficacy of typology, which is based on its capacity to harmonize principle and expression with motivation. Abstract formal clarity with inspired visual articulation in order to express an idea or a concept, as both work at the extremes of the possibilities of the project. One, obsessively offering type as a transcendental quasi-tragic icon, the other as an elusive, dizzying carousel of fantasies. If in the panorama of how type inhabits the practice of architecture since its prehistory, we can now represent the saga of typology in this high period of postmodernism was associated with the evolution from conscious to self-conscious and defined by its activity of criticism. And further, I would like to complete this working model with what it defines the way typology is operating uninterruptedly since then, decisively and almost exclusively in the realm of image itself. In view of this, and for the past 2 decades, many had predicted the death of type and typology in any of its modalities, and for a while, the flurry of enthralling, smooth, atypological images that the contemporary impact of digital technology, computation, ceaselessly produce, seemed to prove that type would never recover its hold. Rightly, it was easy to see that the degradation produced by postmodernism was attributable to the effects of too much image and little substance as the condition where typology survived, and that all that was possible to expect from it was a final fall into historical pastiche. But not so fast. After Rossi and Venturi, it could be said that type, reduced to an icon, became instead a persistent and indestructible representation of a kind of typology in waiting itself. The cabin's image, or the undifferentiating housing block in different renditions, became the refuge of an idea of architecture in an impasse that is now showing signs of ending. How long a condition of no method, no discourse, no self-analysis, plus the exhaustion of theory, in this state of mind did produce a stalemate where type waits as an actor on the sides for the right moment to enter the scene and recover protagonism. In fact, and startlingly, if we look closely, we can trace it in the work of some of the most representative architects of this post-modern period, starting with an unsuspected fellow, Frank Gehry, who in my view is the most consistent typologist of all. Observing deeply and carefully throughout his oeuvre, in between the folds of the formal bravura, there is a clear constant dialogue of his formal experimentation with type at its most basic, almost Rossian version, and a conscious engagement from the outset to the final product, with a typological presence in the recurrence of the image of type in almost all his projects. Just some of the examples from all the different periods of his work. The early house for a filmmaker that dismantles the conventional suburban house but deploys all of his Durandian elements. I hope Michael allows me for this euphemism. Living room, patio, corridor, even the corridor, as if waiting for a renewed method of composition. This cutting up of the domestic typological elements caught up at the expectant moment of waiting for the editor to splice it into a new whole defines well what that Gehry's moment as a preamble to the following stages of his production. Loyola where competing icons of types, the chapel, the temple, the urban housing bar, etc., are deployed in a fragmentary arrangement, and where from its most Roshan element, the long rectilinear bar dotted with equal rectangular basic windows, bursts out the uncontrolled rolling stair. A move of contrasting formal opposites makes its appearance and will become his later signature. It seems that Garys always need to have the immutable city of Rossi in the vicinity. Prague is the proof, where the whole architectural idea depends on a borrowed Baroque metaphor of movement to effect a contextual approach to the historical city by deforming the monotonous dominant infill housing typology. And Bilbao, when even under the most extreme formal exuberance, there remains silent but persistent the Rosian urban types that would connect it to the 19th century city. Those blocks and windows. Finally, Berlin, in my view, his most distilled and elegant rendition of these ideas, where the enforcement of urban design rules in the historic center imposes in the project the calm, discipline, and order of the European city, and where the Gary effect is thus reserved to the interior, where we found the jewel as being offered in an exquisite wooden coffer. We can check Koolhaas on this too. Not a denier of typology himself, his love affair with the skyscraper, his defining favorite type, he seemed for a while unsettled with it in his many trials that oscillates between, on the one hand, his breathtaking CTV, a daring annihilation of the formal, functional, and symbolic characteristics of the skyscraper. Is this now an earthscraper? I don't know. Or on the other, with his notable immediate retraction soon after in a quasi-penitent act of mea culpa with the refutable typological triumphant set in the Rotterdam. Perhaps today the most poignant and persistent example of this typological presence can be found in the work of Herzog and de Meuron, with their insistence on a single image that recurs ritualistically at regular intervals as in a litany of typological reaffirmations, as if to say that in their hearts the Rosian cabin will always be present and that needs to be sacrificed periodically as an act of purification, which is also to acknowledge in these periodic homages, as they do openly, their debt to their teacher. This act of seemingly eternally recurrent reincarnation, which sometimes has the feeling of a requiem, seemed to have reached a moment of mutation that I observed. Well, these were all, it's a long series, that I observed with great interest, and it seems to announce a reversal of this religious tone when the emblematic cabin, imaginatively altered, becomes the generator of one of their most extraordinary, vigorous, and complex interventions, where everything is the same, but also all is change. The Feltrinelli Foundation in Milano recently opened, where the gable section becomes urban morphology, building typology, and memory, which paradoxically, given its historical references, produces a tremendous novelty in this vibrant European modern city. The type has even become indifferent to a corresponding urban morphology, as his gable section has nothing to do with the city of Milano, with this particular neighborhood, and neither with the buildings, original buildings. There were fortification walls at city gates that used to occupy the city. Changed in scale, it is now a gigantic cabin recast in glass and reincarnated as a horizontal skyscraper that reinvigorates and probably shows an aperture to a new direction of a free image in search of a type. Multiple displacements and inversions, conceptual, formal, scalar, material, figurative, that both confuse origins but proceed with typological clarity to reconfigure the city. a lot to be expected from these. Where do I find my thinking about architecture and typology at this moment? I think first, Moneo is still right, and we still have to answer the challenge he posed, now to us, to each generation. Second, what this impasse has given us is the time to understand better not only what was going on in parallel in architecture and sustain with composure and patience the end of the exhausting parade of somewhat sterile by necessary formal experimentation that the arrival of digital technologies of representation produce as the tests needed to run their course. Moreover, we have calmly absorbed the realization that architecture is standing on a new playing ground, and that is playing with old and new protagonists, conditions and rules that need a welcome consideration. But I'm also suggesting that indeed we should consider likely that the questions we ask ourselves today may require, as I believe always had, that we return to the concept of type. It seems that we cannot evict it from the creative process, and that indeed type inhabits the project as a permanent tenant. It should also be welcome back. Under what guise it will show up is unclear. Throughout its history, we've seen it at times to appear as an idea or ideation, at others as a method, as a discourse, as an image, as an icon. Should we not consider the possibility that image might be by now totally independent of iconographic associations and perhaps be considered as free form itself, within which it still may resonate its original typological pedigree, and play with it intelligently, with judicially and architecturally, as Jacques and Pierre seem to be doing here in Milan. As intimated earlier, we have also awakened to the new demands of both modes of conservation, environmental and cultural, with their associated polemics and cultural wars, to the marvels of digital technology, computation, and associated cultural dominance of the world of images, and in short, to all the technological advances in material structures, social formations, and of the crisis in politics and institutions. Such panoply of riches that we are offered should also propel us to try to conceive new possibilities of types. So while accepting Raphael's challenge, I am tempted to take exception to Argand's narrower view of his understanding of the genesis of type as only the result of a synthesis of past occurrences. I truly believe that when we move from the field of scholarship into the world of design, into the project, a type can indeed be invented, but not out of nothing, as some designers had hoped in the recent past as they washed their hand and relinquished their responsibility for making decisions about form to the control of algorithms, but out of architecture itself. That means a close, intelligent relationship between history and design. Sorry, we cannot dream of returning to our infancy, even if we might yearn for the mythical times when the builder could play freely with types, words, forms, and still be surprised by them. But we can see how the powerful combination of history and the project can propel the imagination to yet unimagined results. Thank you very much.
Observation and embracing of a value of typology which over the ages keep appearing and as a protagonist to test us all the time, don't we? So in an age of unconscious and age of oblivion, it's okay. I think this was such an inspiring lecture. I can't believe we heard it, and thank you for preparing. I'm sure it took you months of preparation, your personal history embraced in it, opinions, and this is like essentially the architect at the most excellent form, and I admire your intellectual capacity and your erudition to be able to deliver such an amazing talk tonight. And my task is going back to tribute to Eduard. It was my privilege to know him for more than 3 decades. He was one of the greatest professors of Harvard and is a legend. As the first director of Carpenter Center, you can see photo of young Eduard in Louvre Complete by Le Corbusier. He invented a new curriculum, visual and environmental studies with Albert Zebo, and transformed pedagogy by establishing a course, Historic Urban Spaces, its Morphology and Conservation, to prepare our students for the challenges of the 20th and 21st century. At the end of each academic year, I look forward to working with him for morning exercises of commencement in Harvard Yard. He would walk with his buddies, professors emeriti, clad in capes trimmed in different types of fur, medals dripping from their necks, dressed in colorful gowns and wearing caps in exotic shapes. These friends of Edward's held table every Thursday at lunch at the faculty club. This group is an endangered one and is nearly extinct, and perhaps Eduard might have been the last of its breed. They were distinguished in appearance, able to deliver speeches with flair and erudition. I would say that, Jorge, like you. You also have exotic fur in your gowns, I know. They had endless curiosity, always filled with youthful energy. Their vigorous intellectual pursuit, in top shape, delighted by new challenges that would arise on a daily basis, and kept up with energy level of the students that spiral up as they discover, debate, and inquire all day long. And Eduard was no exception. But once at the faculty club, alas, they refused to recognize Eduard and instead asked for his plastic ID. I knew this was the end of the era. You can imagine Eduard's expression for having to suffer such an indignity at his beloved institution. We also had a joke, which is that some of the paintings hanging on the walls of the faculty club should probably be in the museums. It's because we knew Harvard did not conduct proper survey of its architecture and artifact in its campus until President Du Faust ordered it. We fought against those who proclaimed Harvard is not a museum and treated its treasures shabbily, until Du Faust in contract said university is but a museum, one of a triumphant moment for Eduard. His life was full of productive scholarships demonstrated by tireless researches and writings and teachings. He generously gave lectures and attended critics all over the world. And at the GSD attending thesis reviews until very recently. And he took a role of a consultant for significant organizations, especially for those attempting to preserve heritage sites and historical monuments. In that manner, he was a public intellect. My office at GSD was next to his for many years. Walls in Eduard's office, as you saw in the photo, were packed with books from floor to ceiling on all sides, bulging with papers, pamphlets, and lecture materials. It was like an immense intellectual cave, and he would know exactly where to find specific reference material or a piece of newspaper article stuck in its crevice. Needless to say, it served as an excellent acoustic device which kept his office nice and quiet. Students he taught range in multiple generations, and every day I would see there was someone visiting Eduard. So I always thought that he would be the greatest asset for development office, but I don't know if they took advantage of that. Since we kept the door ajar, I can hear lively discussions going on, and each visitor's new publication inevitably will find a place in Eduard's immense archive. I would sit in his office to discuss meaning of historic preservation or topics of conservation or controversy over restoration or fume over ongoing destruction of heritage sites. We will travel all over the world in our discussions and delve into the examples of precedence analysis. Eduard had an immense and agile mind and able to connect current events and implications of history, which also produced a new reading for historical presence, like what Jorge just did. He always had mischievous twinkle in his eyes as he found absurdity and contradictions and complex social-political background in efforts to save historical sites and buildings. There are always human stories involved behind the edifice of grand monuments. As an architect and preservation consultant, he possessed keen visual acuity to assess significance and beauty in architecture everywhere, like what Jorge just showed us. He was also a great artist. Every Christmas, I loved receiving his Christmas card that has his architectural sketches along with that of Pat's. I kept all of them. We all did. He understood the specificity of cultural relationships in society and its built environment. He acknowledged diverse approaches and meanings and subtleties that different contexts may bring. He was not dogmatic. He knew that a right answer of one place may not be true for another. He always possessed a flexible framework for analysis that reflected peculiarity of each culture. In fact, he took delight in fickle nature of humanity, which offered different perspective to an otherwise static edifice. His expertise is not only on topics which range from Le Corbusier, Christopher Wren, Joseph Hoffman Siam, among others, but he excelled in traversing complex terrain of cultural heritage sites. For example, for preservation of Kathmandu Valley in Nepal. In order to follow his scholarship, it required a pliable intellect and an open mind to understand forces affecting ever-changing agenda in the world we live in and that we lived in. His idea of history is active and alive, an essential dialogue necessary between past, present, and future. His way of historical and cultural reformulation forges a relevant framework of operation for continuity of heritage, which he called common enterprise. He was constantly questioning the state of authenticity, the word you used today, what it means to be authentic and how to value authenticity. He pointed out to me one day that there was no word for authenticity in Japanese, and he's absolutely right. You can imagine that we would have a long discussion on that subject. To value authenticity, it required an inquisitive mindset and indeed an authentic attitude as a scholar, which means an honest, fair, and objective approach which he thought was a responsibility of a scholar. I have witnessed him turning arguments around and around, studying situations from multiple angles, to be objective, accurate, and to be sincere, humane, and truthful. Also, he was an activist. He did not hesitate to offer his opinions on controversial subjects of situation. In fact, he took a delight in it, and he just dove in. I witnessed him engage in a battle with Harvard librarians to try to save Woodbury Poetry Room designed by Alvar Aalto, or to prevent Folk Edition from chopping off part of Carpenter Center ramp designed by Le Corbusier. He cherished these moments, and I was always volunteered happily as an eager accomplice in those situations. He would revel in his victory, and he would declare, there are still more things we can do together. I miss him so much. His beret, his smile, twinkle in his eyes, his energy, passion, and clear vision. Now that he's gone, but his voice is echoing, we can do one or two more things together. It is for us an agenda to keep vigilance over significant architecture and urban spaces, armed with the knowledge and intelligence he instilled in us. We forge forward to carry Eduard's legacy, which defines architects as keeper and guardian of civilization.
Thank you so much for this. It's on? For bringing that spirit back to this evening, and you're reminiscing about some of the most salient aspects of Eduard's legacy and what he left in this building in all of us. I just want to add that I think reinforces some of the things you said. One anecdote, which is so telling about his care for the institution, his interest in the work of architects and the way we think, and also his meticulous way of organizing knowledge and material. For a long time, as you know, the school holds the Gropius lecture on the occasion of the chair to step down at the end of his tenure. You did one, I did one, many others prior to me. And long after I stepped down as chair, one day I was in my office, as you know, he was also my neighbor, and I was working, and I hear a knock at the door, and I open, and there is Eduard. And although he was not big person, he had an incredible presence, and his expression was troubling. He was visibly upset, although composed, and he looked at me and I said, Jorge, I just noticed that I don't have your Gropius lecture in my archive. And I thought, what did I do? And as I thought, he was just standing there and staring at me, and I said, oh, I think I have a copy. I just dig it out and left it, and his smile came back, and he just left, and I'm sure it is a much safer and easy place to get than what I have. I'm a terrible archivist of my own things. It was like that when Eduard was here, of our interaction, always about either the simple things of life or profound issues of our architecture. And I always remember our thought for the Alvar Aalto room, in which we had initial meetings without him, and then we brought him in because I think he was either out of town or something. And frankly, he took over that whole committee. He corrected our letters and made them more vigorous, more militant, and he was not afraid of Harvard. And I learned that from him too, to be critical of the institution of which we are part when necessary. And it was one of the most refreshing, always kind of companionship in those struggles that we every now and then have with our beloved institution. So it's always memorable, all those moments. Yes. I don't know how we want to proceed.
We want to sort of have you both be both in a conversation, but also to open it up, because I think there there's a lot between what hasn't been said about Edward's writings and work, and I think what you, Jorge, have presented, and I'm sure that there are lots of questions. I would like to ask you one quick question, but maybe Toshiko will. You know, I was very intrigued by the relationship between the first part of your talk and the second part. Yeah. The first part, you're dealing very directly with the question of the architectural artifact. And you are, in a sense, the person who is investigating the artifact. And there is little to do with the writing about those artifacts. It's actually the analysis of the building itself as it exists. In the second part of your talk, the relationship between writing and architectural production is a key part of those kinds of discussions. And sometimes you could say that there is a kind of mismatch, if you like, or a gap between the claims that are made in writing and the project that is made in architecture, or that doesn't fit, precisely because the project might not fulfill some of the promise of writing. So I think it would be really wonderful to see if you have some reflections about the status of writing as a component of the thinking in a way that takes place in relation to the discussion of type. Because in the first part, there is both the idea of a precision, but also the notion of exuberance as part of a project of precision, if you can call it that. Sometimes in the second part, it's hard to bring exuberance into a discussion of typology without it becoming something else. So I don't know whether you feel you know, this issue of sort of the writing and the making of the project, you have any thoughts on it? But maybe Toshiko will follow with that.
Well, I think that's part of the lecture, in a way, structure, and my probably failed attempt to represent that in a model in which I recognize three moments: a pre-conscious, a conscious, and self-conscious moments. And that big divide I try to make clear at the beginning is between writing and not writing. My resort to a pre-Renaissance times has to do with that. Of course, there's a lot of written material about the Cathedral of Palermo and Cefalù and all that, but this is all contemporary or, you know, historiographical material. There is absolutely nothing but the artifact and the evidence of what they did. And that's what I found it so refreshing to really understand how these works originally, let's say, in our minds is still there. But of course, then it is beginning to be inhabited and rationalized in which we understand at a given moment how type sort of inhabits our thinking and all that. And we sometimes conceptualize it as an idea, sometimes, as I said, as a method, et cetera, et cetera. So if you notice, and I did it obviously on purpose, I have a lot of slides of magazine covers, book covers, because certainly for my generation, they are in themselves icons. I mean, I recognize all those covers as absolutely meaningful and important to me for what they contain. That architectural design, I still have them, all of them, of the late 60s, which is when I went to school. And so it's, of course, opposition. Ooh, okay. But I ended up by showing that beautiful picture of San Cataldo, the church, the small little tiny toy-like church in Palermo, saying we cannot return to our infancy. We cannot be unconscious about that. So we need, unfortunately, to keep writing and thinking about typology and how we have to reinterpret, since we cannot really get rid of it as architects, how we need to describe to let it inhabit our process of design. So that's all I could say at this moment, yeah.
But also one of the things you made us realize once again, which we forget in these days of unconscious oblivion, is that legibility of plans and legibility of facade. I think you also drew all the plans in the same scale. So you can compare the size and scale and relationships side by side. Eduard did that for his book. I was just looking at Joseph Hoffman's book, and he describes all the plans to the same scale. You can compare the relationship of one building to the other. In a way, Eduard being an architect, his book is constructed like an architecture. I realized that Joseph Hoffman's book is actually an architecture. So in the sense that the writings, as much more flat reading sometimes we get, often does not get supplemented by legibility of architecture. In a way, you will show the images, and your words and images and plans has resonance with each other, so that Edward's relationship with words and text, and that's what building text and context is about, right? So this particular tradition is very, very powerful. And I actually miss this entire discourse in terms of not only the words, but how do we recover the legibility of architecture in a way we understand as a language, which we share in common. So.
Hi, I'm Eric Theophile, and I worked with Eduard in Kathmandu. I started working there in 1990. I was his student as an undergraduate here. I wanted to just say a word because there is a world of his accomplishment that is not visible sitting here. The Patan Durbar Square, which was, as his wife Pat sometimes says, her only competition, and she wasn't jealous. The Patan Durbar Square was Eduard's great love of urban space. When I went there, he said, go there in the afternoon, come in from the eastern gate, and maybe you'll love it like I loved it. So we worked there many years, and as you described, he's a very methodical and sometimes cautious scholar. So when I had dreams of expanding our efforts to other cities and other places in the Kathmandu Valley, he kept us very focused in Patan, at times to my frustration. But the happy end to this story is that in 2015, when we had a big earthquake there, we had been working in Patan for 25 years. We had been working on more than 50 buildings, and we knew what we were doing so that when the quake happened, we could move in and rescue the 7 buildings which fell on his beloved Durbar Square. And when I came back a year ago and met with Eduard with a book we dedicated to him documenting our work, I could honestly say to him that we are saving it, working with the kind of care that you have taught us. And with that, he went through every page of the book, as you all know he would, every single page. And I say that's his great achievement.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? I don't know. Questions for Jorge? Ask.
Can I just remind the students of one thing, coming back to Toshiko's comments about buildings, text, and context? It was actually...
Don't know that your mic, is your mic on?
It's on, yeah, but it's,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I wanted to just remind our students, and I know there are a lot of visitors here, but I just want to talk to the students for a minute, that building text and context, actually, we began with Jorge and Howard Burns precisely when Edward stepped down from teaching his courses, which had been taught forever, and inherited. I just wanted to reaffirm what Toshiko was saying, that we sort of inherited that kind of legacy and articulating it as building text and context. I actually published a little article in what was then the Harvard Design something review, Harvard Architecture Review about this. And I just want the students to sort of know that the history of what they're the history of that. But I did, Jorge, you know how much I like these diagrams. I like the diagrams almost as much as I like the pictures in Sicily. But so I wanted to talk about this this idea that there could be an unself-conscious architecture of techne only, without concern for image, because what that entails is that techne has to be something very thick, very robust. You said it's full of memories. It's full of a kind of almost, how do you call it when animals remember with their bodies rather than with their minds? Yeah, exactly. It's almost that kind of memory of a craft that's a bodily memory almost as much as a mental one. And I'm just wondering, at the other end of time, at the how was it called, the self-conscious, or whatever comes after self-conscious, couldn't you imagine, by working with the image, and I think you're absolutely right, when we talk to our students now, they often begin with the image, unapologetically, they begin with the image. But I'm wondering, in a similar way, if there's a thickness, if there's a memory involved, if there's a process or a procedure, if out of image type, unprecedented types. And I think that was very suggestive when you said that why can't one invent a type? And out of the processing of an image, why can't we expect unprecedented types to emerge?
I have to tell you that the notion of inventing type, I have borrowed and learned from the person sitting to your right, who in many years ago, in his early seminars and workshops, both at RISD and Rice, presented that idea, the idea of typologies, of emerging typologies, how one could begin to conceive new types. I'm a firm believer of that. That's what is my disagreement with Argan, and I only accept that as a kind of view of a historian, but not necessarily of a designer. At the same time, I'm absolutely convinced on this new situation that, and you just confirmed what you say, that we cannot escape image. We live in an era of image, so how we then articulate that, and rather than be left as a kind of inert, complete scene that has no depth. How do we give depth to image now is the way I would think we could reposition ourselves vis-a-vis type and typology as an instrumental operative thing in a contemporary process of design. That's what I don't know. It's kind of mesmerizing and dizzying to look at, for me, and I visited this spring, the Feltrinelli Foundation, because it's such a simple move, but it just puts us upside down, turns everything around, the scale, the materials, with such a simple move. And I think they are themselves abandoning this kind of use of the image only that we have seen appearing in these spotty projects, while they do these all other amazing things. And I think they are bringing all of these things together, but I don't know. This is just pure feeling at this point. I cannot speculate more than beyond that.
Well, I think there's something about it which is what you demonstrated today, is the amazing power of observation. The power we always have to see beyond the images, have the X-ray vision penetrating beyond the trappings and trap of image. I think that's amazing capacity. Yes, I think we are creatures of imagination, but also architects, we have to possess and continue to possess amazing capacity and utilize the power of the observation like you demonstrated for us today. And that's also Eduard's legacy as well.
Please.
Yeah, okay. So Pat Sekler asked me to say something as Austrian on Eduard's research on Hoffmann. And so I will take all my courage together to do that. And I would like to refer to what you said about how do we recover the legibility of architecture, and also what Dean Mostafavi said about the gap sometimes we have between the writing and the analysis of the object. And I think in his 1967 essay, this really incredible essay on the Stocklet House in Brussels, a tribute to Whitcover, and then later in the Hoffmann book, it's just that this gap doesn't exist. So he has this fantastic way taking the famous tradition of the Viennese school of art history, to which we owe Pecht's description of the Pazzi Chapel, that is so beautiful. It's all about description, and then he comes to the, like a detective, he explains how it really works. And so he's very exhaustive in description and very meticulous. But he does it in this beautiful Anglo-Saxon tradition to really write it like a krimi. So you move through the plans, you move through the house, the way he shows you how you enter the Stocklet House and what it means that the one door opens up towards you, then you have to do the step like penetrating in a fortress, the other door opens in the other direction, you come to the vestibule that is in a dark, this antico marble, the antico green, and then to the left there's this double swinging door, and you come into the hall, and there's all this light and this two-story hall, and you start to whisper because it's like a sacred place, and so I really think that it was so refreshing, especially I was trained in the 1990s when post-structuralism completely hit the German-speaking world, like 20 years later than France, to see this very Viennese way, but with this beautiful, fun thing of the Anglo-Saxon tradition. And so I think it's very important because for Eduard, it was never about dropping names or dropping the trendy, concept. It was really about the content. And in this way, I think he really also encouraged a whole generation of young scholars, because which is really not Austrian. He didn't care where you came from, what was your network, what was your background. He really was interested in what you had to say and to contribute. And in this way, he was, even if he wouldn't think so, a real feminist also. So I would like to give this tribute, but also to Pat Sekler, because I think we all don't know, and this will stay their secret forever, how much she truly contributed to this work. And you were talking about the two Christmas cards. I also love that they send the same image together from their different points of view every year. And I think this really shows how much it is. And that's why I would just to end, I think you did this fantastic lecture about typology. But I truly think what Ed was interested was more topology, because for him it was all about relations and not so about image. And coming from Austria, he couldn't give us a greater gift than that.
Thank you.
Well, wonderful. I'm sure that there will be, for many of us, lots of conversations now going on between Jorge's thoughts and presentations of type and typology and Eduard's writings, even the thing that I mentioned about structure and construction and the relationship of construction to the discussion of type and typology, which itself is probably a key component of what Jorge has been working on. So really, thank you all very much. I do want to ask Pat, she has been really wonderful, and in the midst of having to deal with so many big issues that she's had to deal with, she's been also such an incredible supporter and guide to us. And so I really want to thank Pat. And maybe, Pat, I could invite you to come and say a few words of closing and really thank you all again for being here. So welcome, Pat Sekler.
I think most of all what I would like to say is that following on what Toshiko mentioned, that Edward's office door was frequently open. And he really treasured the interchange that he had with the students and faculty that came to visit him. It made a great deal to him. He learned a great deal. And he became very fond of these people. Many of you who are here tonight shared a long-term friendship with him because of those visits in his office. So I hope the faculty here will continue to have their office doors open for the students. The other thing I wanted to say is that, Jorge, I was really grateful for your talk because we had visited all three of the sites that you spoke about. And in the little packet that I put together for you of his Christmas cards, there's an image of the Leopoldsberg Church. It is not identified in there. Does anyone have a packet handy? Yeah. I was too busy greeting people to see whether or not they projected the image on the screen, but the one card in here is of the church that sits up on a hill, which is the very end of the Alps as it meets the Danube River. And during the war, that church was bombed right in the last day of the war. The dome, was this image shown on the screen? No? At any rate, this wonderful little church, in the last days of the war, planes that were going back to Britain had to get rid of their bomb load. They couldn't land if they had bombs in the plane, and they dropped them, whether haphazardly or not. They landed on that church. The dome was partially destroyed. One of the towers was destroyed. The narthex was destroyed as well. And Edward, who was 25 at the time, which is probably the age of a lot of the people in this room, had just finished architecture school and had the task, which I learned later, he did voluntarily. Now, I hope that's true. I tell the story that it's true. To restore that building. I mean, you had a ruin. You had to get up on the roof. You had to get up there to measure it, to find out what you had. And it turned out that it was a wonderful story, actually. It's on the hillside that the Turks had attacked twice when Vienna was being attacked. And it was on that site that they were defeated. So the church is in a very historic place. When Sultan when he taught here, when he visited us in Vienna, he wanted to visit the adjacent church because there's an image in that church of one of his relatives who had come to fight in that war. At any rate, Edward had the task of doing this restoration work. And I think in the long term that his interest in history was born at that moment, not only because he did have wonderful teachers who had taught history, and he himself was doing some historical teaching at the school, but he had to research the history of that little church and go into all kinds of archives, and his knowledge of Latin was very useful at that moment. And he came up with an idea, not really the idea, but he came up with the realization that part of that church originally had been a centralized church. So there you were dealing with a type. And I think the experience of the responsibility of dealing with an historic monument of that intensity really changed his life and guided him through the rest of his career. So this little church, where we were married actually, still stands. At the moment, it's in miserable condition because they're reconsidering what to do with that whole area, and I hope it won't disappear. So buildings are fragile things. And what you cherish, you better watch out for and take good care of. And congratulations to all the students who are here, and I hope you'll have wonderful careers, and I hope you'll have teachers that you love, just the way he loved his students.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll put it together.